The Trade Reform, Accountability, Development, and Employment Act, Trade Act, was introduced in the U.S. lower chamber, the House of Representatives, in June of this year, the 2009 edition. It now has 130 co-sponsors. This includes 10 of the chairmen and chairwomen of the full congressional committees, the leaders, many chairs of the subcommittees, and a very broad array of sponsors, from the conservative Democrats to the progressive Democrats, some Republicans, and the Senate version of the bill was just introduced yesterday in honor of N30, the Battle of the Seattle anniversary date. And that bill went in, including some of the freshmen, the new members of the Senate. So what the Trade Act does, and for people who want to see, I can explain where in the web it is, but I also have some copies of the House version. The House and the Senate versions are slightly different. What the Trade Act physically, and what the meaning of it is we often summarize it when we speak to members of Congress as the 4 R's. Review, replace, repair, and renew. And the idea, the concept of it, is to have a very concrete, non-rhetorical policy description of what we, civil society, cross-sectorally, labor, environment, consumer, faith, family, farm, are for. So if we don't like NAFTA, WTO, what kind of agreements do we want? And so this describes the model of agreements that we want, that we think would have more broad benefits, the process of how to fix the old agreements, and the new process for negotiation to try and make sure future agreements substantively meet the needs of most people. So the first section is review. The bill calls for a study to be conducted by one of our government agencies on a variety of different criteria, not only economic, but the human impacts with respect to access to services, nutrition and access to food, access to medicines, environmental impacts, and for the study to be done specifically on the agreements that, in the U.S. context, have set the models of future agreements. So NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and then a smaller agreement called the U.S.-Jordan Agreement that had some slightly different twists of rules. So these reviews of the agreements are to then be delivered to Congress. And one of the things the review does is it compares it to what we would be for, which gets to the second R, which is replace. The majority of the text of the legislation is actually the substance of what we want. So it describes effectively what must and must not be in trade agreements. So what must be in trade agreements is listed as criteria the U.S. negotiators would have to obtain, and what must not ever again be in trade agreements: mandatory service sector privatization and deregulation, extensions of patents on medicines and seeds, ceilings on food and product safety standards, etc. Those things are listed as things which may not be in future agreements. This includes all of the special new foreign investor rights and private enforcement that exist in the U.S. free trade agreements, not in WTO, but in NAFTA, CAFTA, and all of the bilateral agreements. They're very similar to what's in a bilateral investment treaty, except they, in their enforcement, are attached to the actual trade agreement. So the replace is the what we're for, and it's very non-rhetorical. It's very boring the way it's written. It's written precisely for negotiators in a formal table to be able to actually implement specific policies, not descriptive. It's actually normative. The third part is repair. And sometimes my colleagues, when we are speaking with members of Congress, call this our renegotiate part. The repair, renegotiate. This section calls on President of the United States to renegotiate, particularly those 4 agreements, but it also says that no new agreement can be brought to our Congress or no new agreement signed, entered into, until the repair of the existing 4 major agreements has been delivered to the Congress. And this is the President is, through this legislation, instructed to submit to Congress a proposal for renegotiation. And in the US system, it would be different in every country. In our Constitution, our legislative federal branch has exclusive authority over trade. So for the President to be able to enter into an agreement, authority has to be given, and then Congress has to vote. So this is given authority to go fix these agreements. And no new agreements until they're fixed. Now, in the Senate version of the bill, because our House and our Senate have different operating rules, the Senate version of the bill is strictly enforced because the Senate effectively has no rules of process. Every senator is king. Everything is done by consensus. So the way the Senate bill operates, a senator can raise what's called a point of order and stop the approval of any future agreement unless it meets these criteria. In the House, the Speaker is queen. So these rules don't apply in the House, but for the parliamentary rules of the Senate, this would stop agreements such as the leftover agreements of Bush, the NAFTA-style agreements with Korea, Canada, Colombia, would need to be repaired to meet these criteria. So they would be the first new agreements, and the old agreements need to be fixed. And then the 4th piece is renew. And the bill lays out a replacement for fast track. Fast track was the mechanism, the process in the US used by the Congress to delegate authority, the constitutional exclusive trade authority that Congress has, to the President. The fast track is very outdated. Richard Nixon created this in 1973. And, not surprisingly, it was a huge grab of Congress's power to take to the President. At the time, negotiations were only about tariffs. And now the negotiations are about so many things that are clearly the remit of Congress, that many in Congress believe fast track must be replaced. And so the fast track replacement is described in the final portion of the Trade Act. And it has certain key principles for this new mechanism of delegated authority, such that the actual new standards of what agreements must and must not have are enforceable. The trade agreements can only come back for special expedited consideration if they meet those criteria. And in the past, the delegations have not had any substantive mandatory criteria. So that's an overview of the content.